At the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South stands a building that New York knows better than its own skyline. A hotel that is impossible to miss. A white and cream palace rising above the trees of the park like a castle from the past. A forgotten promise of an era that itself has long since disappeared. The Plaza Hotel. At dawn, it seems almost transparent. Light falls on its mansard roof, French windows and golden cornices, and it seems as if the building is part of a dream left over from the night. But as soon as New York wakes up, the illusion disappears. The park fills with office clerks rushing to work. Taxis line up at traffic lights, and tourists flock to the Pulitzer Fountain. And at that moment, the plaza ceases to be just architecture. It recalls its roles. A backdrop for the American elite, a fortress of wealth, an outpost of urban myth, the arithmetic of power written on its facade, and a stage on which the drama of the United States has been played out for over a century. The plaza is not just a hotel. It is a city in miniature, a city of dreams and a city of duty, a city of luxury and a city of fear. In its halls, negotiations were held, economies were changed, deals were made, careers were ruined, eras were opened and closed. But every legend has a time to answer questions. What happens to a building when it becomes a witness to a country where wealth grows faster than compassion? And what happens to a society that builds such buildings while crises, wars, inequality, and oblivion rage around them? The plaza is a mirror that reflected America. The America that dreamed of becoming great. The America that wanted to be rich. The America that feared its own dark side. From day one, the hotel was created not just for accommodation, but for display. Its purpose was not to provide guests with a roof over their heads, but to give them status. In the Gilded Age of America, when Wall Street wrote the laws of the world and the homes of tycoons began to grow faster than factories, the plaza became their temple. Inside its walls, life was bustling, whispered about in the newspapers, banquets, negotiations, secret deals, invisible wars between old dynasties and new billionaires. Outside stood a city that never slept because it couldn't afford to. The contrast between the luxury of the plaza and the reality of early 20th century New York was too obvious. While one world drank champagne in the halls of the King's Hotel, another world stood in line for hot soup on the Lower East Side. The plaza gave America a promise. Success is possible. The plaza also gave America a warning. Success is a game where the stakes are too high. This hotel has seen it all. How stock markets rose and fell, how presidents changed, how dynasties disappeared, how wealth turned into debt, how the city grew upward but moral standards declined. And today, standing in front of its facade, it is impossible to shake the question. Why has this building outlived all of its creators? And what secrets does it hide beneath its golden chandeliers? Because the plaza is not just architecture. It is the history of America, told through the language of luxury, debt, capital, and illusions. And behind every sparkle, there is a shadow. Behind every success, there is a price. Behind every promise lies a mechanism that inevitably demands repayment. And if you listen carefully, this hotel can still tell you why the country that built it still lives between dreams and anxiety. The history of Plaza began long before its facade became a symbol of New York. It began with a wound, one typical of the Gilded Age. A wound of ambition, insecurity, fear of going unnoticed in a world where wealth grew so rapidly that the rich themselves could not keep up with their own legends. To understand why this hotel was built, you need to understand the people who created it. The first Plaza Hotel appeared on this site in 1890. But it was not the grand palace we know today. It was an expensive but unremarkable hotel. Its owners counted on wealthy tourists, but in late 19th century New York, competition among the elite was fiercer than among steel or copper manufacturers. Legends already stood nearby. The Waldorf, 1893, the Astoria, 1897, the Fifth Avenue Hotel, and the St. Regis. And they all belonged to those who ruled America: the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Goulds. The Plaza, in comparison, looked like an orphan. The customers for the new version of the Plaza were Bernhard Bingham and Frederick L. Young, financiers who dreamed of their own monument in a city where monuments determined social status. It was not just a business project, it was a way to inscribe their names in the pantheon of the New York elite. In an era when millions of immigrants were crossing the Hudson in search of bread, and billionaires were building palaces on Fifth Avenue, every new rich man wanted to leave a mark that could not be erased. And the Plaza was supposed to be just such a mark. For the new version of Plaza, investors made a gesture that in the Gilded Age was considered a sign of their determination. They invited Henry J. Hardenberg, a star architect and designer of the Waldorf Astoria and Dakota buildings. Hardenberg was an architect who knew how to turn money into space and space into status. He understood the psychology of the elite. They needed a facade that spoke louder than their own voices. But the architect also had his own motive: professional jealousy. Hardenberg wanted to build a hotel that would outshine his own Waldorf, and the Plaza became his chance to surpass himself. It was an architectural revenge hidden under a layer of limestone and copper roofing. The plot on the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park was one of the most coveted locations in the United States. It was the entrance to the park, the main symbol of a civilized city. There was no more prestigious place. Here passed processions of old families, carriages of the Gilded Age, the first cars of millionaires, demonstrations of urban wealth. To build a hotel here, one had to possess tremendous courage or tremendous audacity. The Plaza was a challenge to all who believed that Fifth Avenue belonged to the old aristocracy of New York. It was a gesture. We are here too. We are part of this map of power. Since the end of the 19th century, America had been experiencing incredible acceleration. It was a century when capital was created faster than laws, businessmen became gods, workers died on construction sites that were supposed to glorify their owners, cities grew like living organisms, devouring everything around them. Building a hotel of this scale in 1905 meant betting on a future that did not yet exist. New York was skyrocketing as if possessed, and the Plaza was to be its crown jewel, a building that would mark a new chapter in capitalism, a symbol of refined power, a symbol of stability in unstable times, a symbol that money can buy anything, even architectural eternity. Bernhard Bingham, the man who became the main initiator of the project, was a typical representative of the restless elite of the Gilded Age. Rich, but not famous. Influential, but not great. Belonging to circles where money was no longer an argument, symbols were important. And he knew perfectly well that New York only remembers those who leave their mark in stone. The Plaza was his ambition, his public portrait. He wanted to create a building that would outlive him, justify his social status, prove to his rivals that he was not just a shadow of the big tycoons. The Plaza was his challenge to history. And, as is often the case with great projects, this challenge became his curse. The new Plaza was supposed to be the most luxurious hotel in the United States, the most technologically advanced, the most prestigious, the most culturally significant. But behind this lay another, more human dream. The creators wanted to build an ideal world in which their place would finally be recognized. It was an attempt to heal a wound, the wound of insecurity typical of the capitalists of the Gilded Age. They built palaces but lived in fear that their wealth was temporary, that their names would be forgotten, that their victories impressed no one. Plaza was their answer. Their architectural cry, "We exist and we will remain." Fifth Avenue has its own character. It is not just a street. It is a podium on which America demonstrates its sense of grandeur. And when, in 1907, a giant white limestone structure began to rise on its northern arc, facing Central Park, the city understood. This was not just a hotel. It was a statement. The Plaza became one of those rare buildings in which architectural style, technology, engineering, and ideology merged into a single code, a code that can be read as clearly as a political program or the morality of an era. Henry Hardenberg, the architect of the Plaza, was not an avant-garde. His style was old-fashioned even by early 20th century standards. Neo-Renaissance, French contours, strict verticals, and domes reminiscent of Parisian hotels of the Third Republic era. And that was precisely what was important. The Plaza was not supposed to look new, but timeless. Not modernist, but aristocratic. Not American, but European, because Europe was still setting the standard for elite taste at the time. Its facade became a hybrid. French hotels particuliers, British city palaces, Prussian monumentality, and New York's obsession with height. When you look at the Plaza, it is easy to forget that it is a hotel and mistake it for the residence of a great empire. This is precisely the architectural trick. The building promises stability, which its creators themselves did not have. 1907 was the era of skyscrapers, and it had to compete not only with hotels, but also with the monuments of business Manhattan, Singer Tower, MetLife Tower, and the future giants of the Woolworth Building. Plaza did not try to be the tallest, but Hardenberg did something else. He created mass, a volume that overwhelms the passerby. He raised 18 floors, almost 400 rooms, and a giant stone structure that expands toward the ground like the roots of an old tree. It is not height upwards, it is height downwards, not a striving for the sky, but a pressure on the ground. This is not building for beauty. This is building for power. The Plaza was clad in white Indiana limestone, copper roofing, expensive French slate, and massive granite bases. Each material carried a message. Limestone, a symbol of durability. Copper, a symbol of status. Granite, a symbol of steadfastness. French slate, a symbol of belonging to Europe, and therefore to a civilization that for decades was considered an unattainable standard. At a time when workers lived in wooden houses and immigrants in 5-story brick tenements, Plaza demonstrated more than just a romantic image of the old world. It showed the difference between classes, a difference that was deliberately built in stone. Step inside, and it becomes clear that every room here was created not for relaxation, but for impression. The main hall is like a cathedral. The ceilings rise to a height of 3 stories. The lamps, columns, and plaster friezes all scream, "You have entered a temple of wealth." The palm room is an island of eternal summer under an artificial sky. The idea is strikingly modern, to create a space that never ages, never changes the weather, never shows what is outside the window. The Grand Ballroom is the only one in New York with authentic early 18th century European chandeliers. They were smuggled in from France as luxury goods. The law at the time restricted the import of art objects, but no one stopped the Plaza. The entire hotel was built on the principle of a theater. Guests are actors, staff are stagehands, rooms are sets, corridors are wings, and wealth is a special effect. And in this theater, everything is subject to one idea. Wealth should not just be noticeable, it should be undeniable. Underground, behind walls, in closed corridors, there was a second, invisible half of the hotel, a miniature city. Here were located laundries capable of handling hundreds of kilograms of laundry per hour, kitchens designed for banquets for up to 1,000 guests, ventilation, cooling, and heating systems, private power stations, staff rooms, storage levels, and service elevators completely separated from the front elevators. It was a world that guests were never meant to see. The Plaza was designed so that the lives of the staff would run parallel to, but invisible from, those of the guests. Just like in the palace complexes of Europe, on colonial plantations, and in the industrial giants of America. This is where the true ideology of the building is revealed. Power is not something that is demonstrated. Power is what is hidden. The Plaza was not just an architectural object. It was a machine that produced social myths. The myth that wealth is always beautiful. The myth that the elite is a natural phenomenon, not the product of the labor of thousands of people. The myth of luxury as the natural state of the world. Its architecture divided the city into inside and outside, into those who enter and those who serve those who enter. And therein lies its greatness and its shadow. When you look at the plaza from Fifth Avenue, its grand facade seems immovable, as if carved from a single piece of white stone. But anyone who has ever worked inside will tell you, this building is alive. It breathes, hums, vibrates. Its mechanisms start working several hours before the first guests arrive and continue until late at night. It was labor, endless, hard, often invisible, that turned the plaza into the legend that the world knew and revered. But, as in all palaces of power, the work here was divided into two worlds: the visible, smiles, silver, music, and the invisible, sweat, fatigue, long corridors underground. At the beginning of the 20th century, New York was teeming with labor. It was the era of the Great Migration, with steamships bringing tens of thousands of newcomers every week. Working on the Plaza construction site were Italian masons, German carpenters, Irish diggers, Polish plasterers, Jewish and Russian woodworkers, and American workers from poor states. It was, in fact, an international collective, whose sole purpose was to turn the dreams of the rich into stone. Many of these people had never lived in houses with electricity, but they built a hotel that used one of the most advanced lighting systems in the city. They received 20-30 cents an hour, 10, 12-hour workdays, no insurance or protection, and the risk of injuries often fatal. Historians found records of construction accidents, falls from heights, scaffolding collapses, accidents involving lifting mechanisms. The newspapers of those years did not write about them. The tragedies of the workers were not part of the official glamour of the plaza. When construction was completed, the bricklayers were replaced by other armies, the staff. Their numbers were enormous, up to 2,500 employees during the high season, more than 300 cooks, waiters, and kitchen workers, dozens of maids, cleaners, couriers, and doormen. The plaza was one of Manhattan's largest employers, a small state, with its own laws, hierarchies, and invisible infrastructure. Beneath the luxurious halls was an entire underground floor, sometimes two, of labyrinthine service corridors, as the architects called them. Here, beneath the marble and chandeliers, were located staff hospitals, changing rooms, textile storage rooms, huge kitchens with temperatures below 40 degrees, elevator shafts that guests never used, workshops for repairing furniture, costumes, and dishes, mechanical rooms where engineers monitored steam pressure, electricity, and ventilation. It was another world: narrow tunnels, the smell of iron and hot steam, the clanging of metal, the shouts of cooks, the endless clatter of dishes. If the image of the American dream reigned above, then here, below, was its mechanism, requiring human energy every minute. The staff was divided not only by function, but also by nationality, status, and even accent. The Irish traditionally held positions as porters and doormen, the face of the hotel. Italians and Greeks worked in the kitchens. African Americans worked in delivery, cloakroom, and hotel service. Jewish immigrants were involved in accounting, safekeeping, and administrative work. Even within the underground corridors, there were invisible boundaries, a social map of the hotel that guests would never see. The plaza was not only a place of luxury, but also a reflection of the American class system. And the richer the hotel, the stricter the order of its internal world became. Few people know that the plaza's kitchens were considered the largest in the world at the time. At the beginning of the 20th century, they prepared up to 10,000 meals a day, served banquets for up to 2,000 guests, and used ingredients from all over the world: oysters from Long Island, French butter, Scottish salmon, Asian spices. Workers recalled that during lunchtime, huge vats of soup bubbled so vigorously that the air was constantly humid and hot. Kitchen workers suffered burns almost daily, but the work never stopped. The plaza was a machine, and a machine had to keep running. No one ever saw the maids at the plaza at work. That was the principle. The workrooms had to disappear before the guest noticed their presence. It is known that the maids took special courses: how to move absolutely silently, how to change bed linen in 90 seconds, how to arrange objects in a room with centimeter precision, how to never make eye contact with guests unless the situation required it. The Plaza was a world of elites, but it was run by women whom no one saw. The diaries of Plaza employees from the early 20th century have been preserved, and in them there is no enthusiasm, only fatigue. One former elevator operator wrote, "I lift people up to the sky, but I myself remain underground." A waiter wrote, "We served champagne to people whose estates were larger than our entire neighborhood, and we walked home to save 5 cents." These are honest testimonies of the era. Luxury was always produced by people who could not afford even its cheapest elements. The hotel was created as a symbol of the American dream: prosperity, hope, growth. But inside there was a mechanism at work that showed the opposite: that this dream was built on the labor of those who would never come close to achieving it. And the more luxurious the hotel became, the deeper the gap between guests and staff grew. The Plaza became more than just a hotel. It became a social microcosm in which visible beauty existed only at an invisible cost. If the early history of the Plaza was a series of ambitions and bets on the future, the first decades of the 20th century turned it into something more than a hotel. It became a center of social gravity, a magnet for the wealthiest families, a salon of influence where the cultural codes of America were formed. From the 1910s until the mid-20th century, the Plaza experienced its true golden age, a time when princes and actresses, diplomats and stock market magnates, poets, dancers, bankers, and presidential advisors passed through its doors. It became more than just a bohemian refuge, it became a place of power. The Grand Ballroom, completed in 1921, became one of the most luxurious venues in the United States. Frescoes inspired by French Rococo, huge mirrors, and crystal chandeliers imported from Europe made the hall resemble not a banquet hall, but a stage at Versailles. It was here that high society debutantes made their first appearances before journalists. Billionaires held weddings comparable in scale to state celebrations, and charity balls were held by the old elite, the Morgans, Rockefellers, and Vanderbilts. The International Debutante Ball, which began in the 1950s, turned the Plaza into a place where the status of families on the world stage was measured. The girls were presented not just to society, but to an entire class of heirs to empires. These were events that created legends. Orchestras played their hearts out here, and toasts were made that decided the fate of dynasties. Plaza became a space that absorbed culture. It was here that Scott Fitzgerald presented his Gatsby universe. Elvis Presley stayed during his tours. Marilyn Monroe appeared at premieres and private parties. European aristocratic families held receptions. Harry Truman and John Kennedy used the hotel as an informal venue for negotiations. Fitzgerald lived at the Plaza in episodes. Sometimes he came with his wife Zelda to dance until dawn in the Palm Court. Sometimes he arranged meetings with editors. It was said that he loved to walk through the ballrooms at night when the cleaners were taking out the flowers after the receptions. He loved to listen to the echo of wealth fading into emptiness. It was this atmosphere that he later captured in The Great Gatsby, a novel about dreams and destruction, about glamour that cannot hide the cracks. The Palm Room became a symbol of high society, just as the Eiffel Tower is for Paris. Here, tea was drunk by first ladies, heirs to the fortunes of railroad magnates, famous silent film actresses, and journalists who determined the tastes of America. From the late 1910s, the Palm Court became the nerve center of society gossip. Newspapers wrote, "If you want to know who is setting the course for New York, look at who is drinking tea at the Plaza." But behind this elegant ritual lay a social machine. Every tablecloth, every vase of lemons, every flower was the result of the labor of dozens of workers who were not allowed to appear in front of the guests. The Plaza was not just beautiful, it was revolutionary. By the 1920s, it had already introduced an automatic telephone exchange, one of the first in U.S. hotels, a pneumatic tube system between floors, push-button staff call buttons, mechanized kitchens with the latest equipment, and industrial-grade refrigeration. Against the backdrop of these innovations, guests experienced a sense of magic. It was as if everything happened by itself. Tea appeared in cups, luggage disappeared and reappeared in rooms, and rooms sparkled with cleanliness, as if there were no giant with hundreds of invisible hands behind it all. The hotel became an unofficial meeting place for Wall Street bankers before the crash of 1929, industrial magnates during World War I, European diplomatic missions, and New York City's elite who influenced elections. In 1907, during the banking panic, several influential financiers used the Plaza as their secret headquarters. There they discussed saving banks, stabilizing markets, and distributing loans. These conversations, held in the hotel's private salons, effectively changed the financial map of the United States. The Plaza became the place where America made decisions about its own destiny, but did so behind closed doors. At the height of its glory, the Plaza created the impression that a world without chaos was possible, that luxury was natural, that wealth meant stability, that happiness was a matter of the right arrangement of tables and music. But this illusion was as thin as the gilding on a mirror frame. Cracks were already forming inside. Rising costs, social tension in the city, instability in the U.S. economy, dependence on old money, invisible labor whose cost was much higher than wages. The era of glamour was still alive, but its foundations were already beginning to shake. It was a dawn that did not notice the approaching storm. By the middle of the 20th century, the Plaza was still shining brightly, but it was no longer the light, carefree brilliance it had in the early years of its grandeur. If you listened closely to the hotel, you could hear a faint metallic creaking, as if long hidden seams were beginning to come apart in its mechanisms. Nothing great collapses at once. First, fatigue appears in the foundation, then a web of cracks in the system, and finally, the moment when the legend no longer matches reality. In 1929, when the market crashed, New York became a city of contrasts. Bread lines stretched along the sidewalks, while at the Plaza, behind the glass of the Palm Court, orchestras still played. But the illusion of stability did not last long. The hotel had to cut staff, freeze infrastructure upgrades, lower prices for some services, temporarily close certain rooms. Banquet halls, where billionaires had recently discussed deals, now hosted charity committees trying to save impoverished families. And although the Plaza weathered the crisis better than many hotels, thanks to its elite clientele and strategic location, internal tensions became a constant companion. The expensive interiors required maintenance, the systems needed modernization, and the owner's debts slowly accumulated. During the war years, the Plaza faced a new challenge, growing moral pressure. While thousands of young Americans were being sent to the front, fashionable soirees seemed provocative to society. Many old customers preferred more modest venues so as not to flaunt their wealth. The hotel began to actively cooperate with the military. It provided venues for charity balls, accommodated high-ranking officers, and hosted confidential diplomatic negotiations between allies. It was a period when the Plaza was balancing on a knife edge. It had to be both luxurious and patriotic, glamorous and modest, open and closed. But most importantly, the war accelerated cultural change. The world that the Plaza was created to reflect, a world of old money, strict rules, and formal receptions, was ceasing to exist. After 1945, a new class flooded into America. War winners, entrepreneurs, veterans who built new industries, aviation, technology, cinema, television. Their perception of luxury differed from the old family traditions of the Vanderbilts or Astors. They preferred independence to rigid rituals, freedom rather than ceremonies, new modern hotels rather than the golden halls of the grand era. The Plaza found itself caught between two eras. It was too traditional for the younger generation and too expensive for the older generation, which was gradually disappearing. New types of hotels appeared in Manhattan. The St. Regis became a favorite spot for movie stars after its renovation. The Waldorf Astoria built a new tower and became a center for diplomacy. The Carlyle became a political refuge for the elite. The Plaza was still a symbol of New York, but increasingly a symbol of New York's past. The hotel continued to attract tourists from around the world, but its competitors were winning over its wealthiest guests, those who shaped the cultural and political climate. The 1907 building required enormous investments: worn-out steam systems, outdated elevators, an electrical network designed for gas and lamps from the era of progress, kitchens that needed complete renovation. Each repair cost millions. Every delay in renovation increased the risk of an accident. This battle against time was invisible to guests, but for the owners it became a nightmare. The Plaza was expensive to build and even more expensive to maintain. It seemed as if the hotel was trying to remain a monument to the past and function as a facility of the future at the same time. The 1960s brought to New York the civil rights movement, student protests, rising crime, and financial difficulties for the municipality. Where limousines had rustled 10 years earlier, now the slogans of protesters could be heard. Against the backdrop of social upheaval, the Plaza's golden facade began to look too bourgeois, too much a symbol of inequality. With each passing year, the line between legend and reality became more and more noticeable. Luxury used to be perceived as a promise of the American dream. Now it was increasingly seen as a distortion of it. The Plaza retained its status but lost its dominance. The hotel management carried out expensive interior renovations, invited European designers, expanded the capabilities of the Palm Court, and stepped up marketing on an international level. But it was like restoring a palace in the age of skyscrapers. Beautiful, expensive, historically significant, but no longer defining of culture. The Plaza ceased to be New York's main hotel. It became New York's legendary hotel. The difference was enormous. By the end of the 1960s, it became clear. The model on which the Plaza had relied for half a century, a combination of the old elite, formal luxury, social ritual, and material splendor, was beginning to crumble. Not abruptly, not dramatically. It was like the gilding on mirror frames. Imperceptible, but irreversible. The era of grandeur was not yet officially over, but its internal mechanisms had already ceased to function. The Plaza was entering a period of transformation, an inevitable conflict with the reality of the new century. By the end of the 1960s, Plaza stood on the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park, like a monument to another civilization, a civilization that no longer existed. Its creator, Henry Hardenberg, had long since passed away. The first owners, heirs to old families, had melted away in a cloud of bank mergers and legal structures. Now, for the first time in its history, the Plaza found itself in a position it could not control. It had become too expensive, too complex, too symbolic to belong to anyone alone. This was the moment when the hotel entered a new phase, a phase of struggle for survival and rethinking its destiny. Its walls were no longer protected by the aura of the unshakable elite. It became an asset, an object of trade, a problem, and an opportunity. And each generation of new players tried to answer the same question: what to do with a legend that no longer pays for itself? The 1970s were a turbulent decade for New York. Crime was on the rise, the economy was in decline, and the city was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Under these conditions, maintaining the Plaza became a monstrous financial burden. The old families, those who, back in the 1920s, could pay for lavish banquets and hall rentals without hesitation, had disappeared or moved to Beverly Hills, Palm Beach, to new areas where wealth was hidden behind surveillance cameras rather than displayed under the frescoes of the ballroom. The Plaza ended up in the hands of scattered shareholders for whom it was not a home, not a cultural heritage, but an expense item in the annual report. Money flowed, the roof leaked, the mechanisms leaked. The hotel was aging and in need of major repairs. but who was supposed to pay for it? In 1972, the Plaza was acquired by Western International Hotels, later Westin. This event marked the beginning of the corporate era in the hotel's history. The hotel no longer belonged to the romantics of capitalism or the old aristocracy. It passed into the hands of people who measured everything in terms of annual return on investment. What did this mean in practice? Staff reductions, standardization of processes, cuts in spending on luxury services, renovations only in those areas that were profitable. For the first time in almost a century, the Plaza began to lose its individuality. Becoming part of a large chain, even its interior began to be standardized, as if someone was trying to smooth out its character to create universal comfort for the mass tourist. But the Plaza never was and could never be universal. Its strength and its weakness was that it was too unique, too architectural, too theatrical. The 1970s and 1980s were a period of constant conflict between the owners and the hotel workers' unions. The workers, maids, elevator operators, concierges, cooks, cleaners, were an invisible part of the Plaza legend for decades. Their hands created magic, but that magic was poorly paid. Growing competition among New York hotels forced corporations to cut costs, and cost-cutting always started with the workers. Strikes followed one after another. In some cases, the hotel stood idle for weeks. And for the first time in nearly 80 years, the halls were filled with protest chants instead of waltzes. The grand entrance, where the Roosevelt's carriages and the Vanderbilt's limousines once stopped, became a picket line. This struggle was not only economic, it was symbolic. The Plaza became an arena for conflict between the old idea of domestic elite luxury and the new reality of corporate efficiency. By the early 1980s, the hotel had changed hands again. It was bought by Westin Hotels and then by several international holding companies. In 1988, a man appeared on the horizon who would change the fate of the Plaza for decades to come: Donald Trump. His motives were transparent. He wanted to own a symbol of New York. He wanted to go down in the city's history. He wanted to make the Plaza the crown of his imperial real estate portfolio. But at the same time, he faced a paradox. The Plaza could not be modernized without destroying its past. On the other hand, it was impossible to preserve its past without investing huge sums of money, the return on which was becoming increasingly unrealistic. Trump bought the hotel for $407 million, an amount that industry experts already considered unreasonable at the time. He called the Plaza the greatest hotel in the world, the jewel of New York. But he himself hardly understood what a financial disaster he was taking on. The Plaza once again found itself in the role of a beautiful but uncomfortable truth. People wanted to see it as a symbol, but they did not want to pay the price for it. For several years, the owner hosted social evenings, fashion shows, charity balls, and world-class wedding ceremonies at the Plaza. The hotel often appeared in the press as the venue for the Grammy Awards, as the venue for Oscar de la Renta's fashion shows, as the venue for celebrity weddings, as the backdrop for Hollywood films. But behind the facade, a different reality prevailed. Debts were mounting, maintaining the building cost tens of millions a year. Lawsuits with unions continued, and new renovations were needed that no one could afford. The legend shone on the outside and crumbled on the inside. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Plaza had become what many great buildings become in their old age. Not so much a hotel as a historical problem. It was too valuable to close, too expensive to renovate, too beloved to let die, too cumbersome to fit into an era of high speeds and minimalism. Every new owner felt the same thing. The Plaza is not a purchase. The Plaza is a cross to bear. And yet no one could let it go. Because the Plaza is New York. But New York is always a struggle between dreams and calculations. The hotel was facing its most difficult period. A great turning point, when its essence, purpose, and form would be radically changed in order to survive in the 21st century. When a legend becomes too heavy to stand on its own 2 feet, the world begins to push it toward change. This is exactly what happened to the Plaza. At the turn of the 20th century, the hotel entered the most dramatic turning point in its history. It was a moment when the old world was finally collapsing, and the new one did not yet know what to do with the symbols of the past. And Plaza, like many great buildings, found itself caught up in a cycle: restoration, crisis, sale, reconstruction, new ideology, new crisis. After Donald Trump bought it, an era of ambitious and economically questionable decisions began. Trump sought to transform the Plaza into the pinnacle of late 1980s New York glamour: lavish banquets, press conferences, large-scale parties, and high-profile announcements. He widely used the hotel as a symbol of his status. However, all these events were merely a beautiful facade covering up a financial void. By early 1992, the huge loans taken out to buy the Plaza had become unmanageable. The New York real estate market was in decline, and banks were demanding repayment of debts. As a result, Trump lost his controlling stake. Creditors demanded restructuring. Formally, he remained the face of the project, but real power passed to international investors. For the first time, the Plaza was not just a luxury hotel, but a hostage to global financial structures that did not care what the building meant to the history of New York. Only one thing mattered: whether it was profitable. The turning point, a decade when the world was rethinking itself after the Cold War, was a time of survival for the Plaza. To keep the Plaza open, the owners cut staff, closed some services, froze capital repairs, offered new VIP programs to attract ultra-rich tourists from Japan and Saudi Arabia. The hotel lived on its name, but in reality it had become an object of slow resource depletion. The old interiors were decaying, furniture frames were collapsing, the heating and water supply systems were on the verge of failure. Every year the Plaza resembled a museum more and more, not so much in terms of its grandeur as in its fragility. In 1995, Singapore-based Millennium and Copthorne Hotels became the owner. They saw in the Plaza a world-class brand, a prestigious location, an opportunity to attract Asian investors and tourists. They invested millions in cosmetic repairs to the facades, partial renovation of the rooms, and modernization of the electrical systems. But all these actions were just a band-aid on a ruptured aorta. The Plaza needed not renovation, but a profound rethinking. In the early 2000s, it became clear that the Plaza would not survive in its current form. The costs of maintaining the enormous building exceeded its income. The Palm Court restaurant required major renovations. Balconies and stucco elements began to crumble. And in 2004, a decision was made that shocked all of New York. The Plaza would be closed. On April 2nd, 2005, the hotel doors slammed shut for the first time in nearly a century. Hundreds of employees, many of whom had served at the Plaza for decades, took to the streets with tears and posters. It became a symbol of the end of an era, the end not only of jobs, but of an entire urban tradition. The new owners, Israeli company Elad Properties, proposed a revolutionary plan to transform the hotel into a combination of ultra-luxury residences, elite apartments, and a reduced hotel fund. This decision was both pragmatic and destructive. The Plaza ceased to be a hotel in the classic sense. The very idea of it as a symbol of affordable luxury died, and it became an object for ultra-rich buyers of elite real estate. Real architectural historians called this process deconstructing the symbol into its elements. Some of the premises were dismantled, altered, or rebuilt. Some interior walls were removed to create large living spaces. The ballrooms and ceremonial halls were restored, but their purpose changed. The Palm Court remained, but in a new commercial format. The upper floors were completely converted into apartments, costing from several million to tens of millions of dollars. All this was not destruction, but a transformation comparable to a heart transplant for a legend. During the renovation, disputes arose. How to preserve the historical appearance? What to do with antique chandeliers and furniture? Which areas should be private? Which should be open to the city? Thousands of items, from gilded door handles to vintage chairs, were sold at auction. Collectors picked apart the plaza piece by piece. Newspapers wrote, "America is selling off its past piece by piece." But many elements were carefully preserved. The legendary ballroom, the palm court, the marble-lined corridors, the paintings above the staircases, the exterior appearance of the facade. The plaza entered the 21st century as a hybrid, half museum, half hotel, half private palace for the super rich. By the time it reopened in 2008, the plaza had become a symbol of the globalization of capital, the urban transformation of New York City, the changing identity of the city, and the transformation of cultural landmarks into investment vehicles. But with this came new questions. Can a historic hotel survive as a real estate brand? Does a legend become an empty shell if it loses its original purpose? Can the spirit of the plaza be preserved if it no longer belongs to the city? Hundreds of tourists continued to photograph the golden doors, unaware that half of the building is now privately owned and inaccessible to the public. The plaza has become luxurious again, but in a completely different sense. The transformation of the plaza revealed a paradox of the 21st century. The more valuable a historical object becomes, the less accessible it becomes to society. The plaza has gone from being the cultural center of New York to an investment showcase for the world's elite. It is no longer just a hotel, it is an asset, a brand, a tool in the global financial game. But at the same time, the plaza remains and will remain a symbol in which New York sees its past, its present, and the future it fears. Any legend that has lived long enough in human memory will sooner or later attract a shadow. And the brighter the facade shines, the thicker the darkness that gathers around it. The Plaza, a hotel that for decades symbolized the luxury, power, and cultural prestige of New York, was no exception. Its golden corridors have witnessed major deals and love affairs, diplomatic negotiations, and family tragedies. But the real dark chapters began when the plaza found itself at the center of social, political, and media scandals related not so much to crimes as to what could be called the moral upheaval of the era. The closure of the plaza for renovation was an event comparable to an earthquake. The New York press wrote, "The city has lost a part of itself." But the most sensational thing was not the closure itself, but what preceded it. Week after week, hundreds of workers gathered in front of the hotel entrance. Cooks, elevator operators, maids, waiters, people who for decades had been the invisible creators of the luxury admired by millions of guests. They chanted that their dismissal was not restructuring, but betrayal. They were the first to publicly raise a question that no one had dared to ask before. What price do ordinary people pay for the renewal and survival of a legend? This conflict was the first step in destroying the myth of the plaza as the place where dreams come true. It showed that beneath the golden chandeliers lies a heavy layer of social reality. Although the plaza was never a place of mass crime, it repeatedly found itself at the center of media scandals involving famous personalities. The 1980s, an era of media storms. During Donald Trump's ownership, the hotel became the scene of high-profile lawsuits, high-profile divorces, including his own from Ivana, deals discussed in the press, and financial drama involving debt and restructuring. For the media, the plaza became the backdrop for the story of Trump's fall and rise, a chronicle of how owners can transform luxury into a tool of influence. The hotel found itself drawn into a new media reality. Publicity became not the finishing touch to the legend, but a destructive tool that turned private conflicts into national headlines. In the early 2000s, when Elad Properties announced plans to turn most of the hotel into luxury residences, New York exploded. Activists took to the streets, architects wrote open letters, and historians spoke out in the media. The main question was, does a private company have the right to turn a cultural heritage site into a private club for the super rich? The conflict was symbolized by an episode when the owners proposed removing part of the historic interiors to make room for residents' elevators. The city's Historic Preservation Authority declared this an unacceptable interference with the cultural DNA of New York City. The scandal grew month after month, and for the first time in a long time, the plaza became not a symbol of wealth but a symbol of the global crisis of identity in cities where privatization is displacing culture. One of the most talked about scandals was the increase in foreign investment in Plaza's ownership structure. When Elad Properties, owned by Israeli billionaire Issa Elzer, bought the hotel in the early 2000s, the press was more concerned not with the origin of the capital, but with the question, what will happen when the legend becomes just an investment object? The problem ran deeper. The share of local owners was decreasing. The city was losing control over the historic site. Accessibility was declining. And the hotel was increasingly becoming an asset for international corporations. The public discussed this as the colonization of cultural space by global finance. After the 2008 restoration, a new conflict arose. Many buyers of luxury residences at the plaza filed lawsuits against the developer. Their accusations included the quality of the housing did not match what was advertised, problems with sound insulation, equipment malfunctions, infrastructure deficiencies, and illegal changes to the designs. The irony was that real estate positioned as the pinnacle of luxury faced problems typical of mass construction. Newspapers quipped, even legends are sometimes built from drywall. Over the years, Plaza has indirectly appeared in law enforcement materials. As a possible venue for negotiations between business groups, as a location mentioned in investigations into financial schemes, as a place where closed meetings of intermediaries in large deals were held. The hotel was not involved in any crimes. It was a stage where the interests of different forces intersected. This stage has not changed since the banking meetings at the beginning of the century. It is just that now it is illuminated by the digital age in which it is impossible to hide even a shadow. The quietest, but most devastating, scandal took place without the cries of protesters and without television cameras. After the renovation, the plaza became half closed, half elite, half inaccessible. Its public spaces were reduced, and the places where the city once gathered disappeared or were turned into private rooms. The golden age of the Palm Court, when every New York journalist could see the mayor or a writer at the next table, was gone forever. The plaza no longer belonged to the city. And that was the darkest chapter. Not the scandals about money or lawsuits, but the disappearance of the idea that a legend could be part of public life. The most tragic thing about the plaza's history is not the destruction of its interiors, the departure of its employees, or investors from other countries. The most tragic thing is that the plaza has lost its role as a cultural mediator between society and the elite. It has become luxurious but lonely, rich but empty, legendary but inauthentic. And this is not the fault of the architects or owners. It's just what happens to symbols when time starts demanding new functions from them, and they can't deliver. The most tragic thing about the plaza's history is not the destruction of its interiors, the departure of its employees, or investors from other countries. The most tragic thing is that the plaza has lost its role as a cultural mediator between society and the elite. It has become luxurious but lonely, rich but empty, legendary but inauthentic. And this is not the fault of the architects or owners. It is simply what happens to symbols when time begins to demand new functions from them and they cannot provide them. America's greatest buildings have never been just architecture. They are tablets on which eras leave their mark. And the plaza is one of the clearest examples of how architecture reflects not only the wealth of its owners, but also the metamorphoses of culture, economics, politics, and morality. If you look at its facade for a long time, you will notice that it has changed a little in over a century. The same arches, the same marble entrance, the same turrets inspired by French chateaux, but everything that surrounds this building and everything that happens inside it has changed dramatically. Plaza has become a mirror, not of the America shown on postcards, but of the America that is growing, conflicting, making mistakes, and trying to understand its future. When the plaza opened in 1907, it was part of a phenomenon that historians refer to as the Late Gilded Age. Early 20th century America was undergoing a transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial one, from local markets to national ones, from decentralized power to corporate empires. And in this dynamic, the plaza became the stage for a new elite that wanted to look as grand as its European counterparts. Railroad owners, oil magnates, Wall Street financiers. They were all looking for a way to cement their status not only with money, but also with rituals. The plaza became just such a ritual. It was the place where America first said to itself, "We are not just a country of opportunity. We are a country of heritage." The plaza was not just luxurious, it was theatrical. Its interiors concealed an important cultural mechanism. Guests saw their own ambitions reflected in its gilding. American luxury acquired a European language, here for the first time. Debutante balls, diplomatic receptions, private clubs, musical evenings, literary salons. But most importantly, the plaza fostered a special social phenomenon, American public luxury, in which wealth became a spectacle. The fact that reporters stood at the entrance, capturing guests on the pages of newspapers, made the plaza a conduit between the private lives of the elite and the public eager to observe them. In this sense, the plaza became a precursor to modern media culture. It turned social status into a story. But no shiny facade can stand without hidden structures. And the main structure of the plaza is labor. Invisible, underappreciated, but decisive. Throughout the 20th century, the hotel was sustained by the work of people whose names rarely appeared in the newspapers. Dozens of doormen, hundreds of maids, cooks, elevator operators, engineers, waiters, and technical service workers. Their shifts lasted 12-14 hours. Their salaries were many times lower than the cost of a single dinner in the ballroom. Their efforts were the invisible fuel that powered the machine of wealth. From a social history perspective, this is one of the most important parts of the plaza's legacy. It exemplified the American paradox. A country that prides itself on equality builds the most luxurious spaces on the labor of those who could never afford them. And the more luxurious the hotel became, the more this symbolic line became apparent. Plaza is a miniature model of the American economy of the 20th century. 1. The Age of Growth, 1907-1929. Capitalism promised endless growth. Plaza grew and prospered, just like Wall Street. 2. Crisis, 1929-1939. The Depression hit the hotel as hard as it hit the entire country. 3. Revival, 1940s, 1960s. The hotel once again became a cultural center, a symbol of America's triumph. 4. Inequality and corporatization, 1970s, 1990s. The old owners left, and control passed to corporations as it did throughout the country. 5. Globalization and financialization, 2000s. The hotel ceased to be a cultural object and became an investment asset. This reflected an era when real estate became a global commodity. The plaza echoed the trajectory of American capitalism. The plaza has always been a borderline space. It divided people. Those who lived in luxury rooms. Those who built those rooms with their own hands. Those who could come to the Palm Court. And those who used the back entrance for years. And at the same time, it united them within a single system. A system where status was determined not by origin, as in Europe, but by access to wealth. The plaza became an architectural textbook on the class structure of the United States. There were no dukes or counts here, but there were billionaires, kings of the market, heiresses, princesses of the galleries, politicians, domestic monarchs of democracy. America created its own hierarchy, and the plaza became its stage. The main transformation took place after 2005. The plaza ceased to be a public luxury. It turned into a private luxury, inaccessible to most. This change is symbolic. At the beginning of the 20th century, the luxury of the plaza was a stage that everyone could see. In the 21st century, it became a product that cannot be seen without a pass, budget, and connections. The hotel, created as a symbol of democratic snobbery, Luxury for observation became a luxury behind glass, a luxury for those who can buy not just a room, but a share in the legend. The plaza reflects the answer to the question, what happens when global capitalism consumes culture? The answer is simple. Culture disappears as a social phenomenon and remains only as a commodity. Different generations see Plaza differently. For the older generation, it is a place of balls and radio broadcasts of the 1930s. For Hollywood fans, it is a scene from Home Alone 2, Mean Girls, and dozens of other films. For New Yorkers, it is part of the cityscape. For historians, it is an artifact of the Gilded Age. For investors, it is a way to preserve capital. The plaza has been divided into versions. Each of them is true and each is incomplete. This is where its cultural power lies. It forces society to argue about what it values in the past, style or meaning, facades or functions, history or capital. The plaza is both magnificent and dangerous. Magnificent because it reminds us of New York's golden age. Dangerous because it demonstrates how easily beauty can become a tool of exclusion rather than unity. This paradox is not a flaw in architecture. It is a mirror of society. Plaza shows America its own shadows. Inequality, the thirst for status, weariness with change, attempts to preserve the illusion of stability, the tendency to turn history into a commodity, and the belief that beauty can justify a high price. It shows how the country is changing through what is changing within its walls. Plaza is not just a hotel. It is an X-ray of society, an image that is not always pleasant, but always true. Today, there is still a doorman standing at the entrance to the plaza. Uniform, white gloves, perfect posture, a gesture that hasn't changed for 100 years. But if you look closely, it becomes clear that this is no longer the plaza. It was in the era of debutantes and the clatter of silver spoons in the palm court. This hotel has undergone more transformations than some countries. In the 21st century, it has become a battleground for new economic forces fighting for the right to own a symbol. And at the same time, an example of how global capital is rewriting cultural heritage to suit its own needs. What is happening to the plaza now is not just the story of one building. It is an allegory of the fate of American luxury in an era of financialization, climate uncertainty, and social stratification. In 2005, a period began that many historians refer to as the third life of the plaza. The hotel was closed for extensive renovations, the first such radical overhaul since 1907. Outwardly, it remained the same, but inside a restructuring was taking place that reflected the new priorities of American capital. The number of rooms was reduced, turning them into more expensive suites. Part of the building was sold as luxury real estate, apartments worth tens of millions. The hotel became a hybrid, combining a hotel, a residential complex, and commercial space. The idea was clear. The plaza was to generate profit not only through guests, but also through the ownership of space as a commodity. But with this move, the plaza entered a new reality. It ceased to be a cultural object and became a financial instrument, as attractive to investors as it was distant from the public role it had played throughout the 20th century. By the 2010s, Plaza was at the center of a chain of sales that became a symbol of a new era. The Israeli company El Ad Group, which managed the reconstruction, sold part of its assets to Qatari investors. Later, at various times, interest was shown by Indian entrepreneurs, private funds from the Middle East, and North American financial groups. These purchases were not emotional, as they had been for previous owners such as Bernard Gimelstob, Conrad Hilton, and Donald Trump. For the new players, the plaza was an investment portfolio, a global asset, part of a strategy to capitalize on real estate in the global market. This dynamic echoes what has happened to many historic buildings in London, Paris, and Hong Kong. Architectural symbols become objects that are traded like oil or stocks. And here lies an important historical turning point. The hotel, created as a stage for the American dream, became an element of the international game of capital, more powerful and impersonal than anything the Gatsby era had ever known. Today there are two versions of the plaza. The public one is what tourists see. The foyer with crystal chandeliers, the palm court, where breakfast is served on silver and porcelain, and the corridors where tours take place. This plaza is decorated nostalgia. It reminds us of movies, novels, and stories of the past. But there is also a closed plaza, a world of private apartments, hidden behind doors with electronic locks, where hotel guests do not enter. This space belongs to those who bought not housing, but a piece of legend. The paradox is that many of these apartments stand empty for most of the year, serving as capital storage. The plaza has become a symbol of the phenomenon of ghost apartments. Elite properties that no one uses as a home but everyone uses as a financial safe. Despite modernization, Plaza remains a huge working system. But it is changing too. Generations of families used to work here. Fathers brought their sons, mothers brought their daughters. Plaza was a place of stability in a city that rarely offered it. Now, after a series of sales and restructurings, unions are staging protests, salaries and positions are changing under pressure from corporate policies, some services have been outsourced, the workload is increasing, and privileges are being reduced. For labor history experts, this is a reflection of the United States itself. Luxury is growing, but labor is becoming less secure. Plaza is once again a mirror. The plaza is located on the corner of Central Park, next to one of Manhattan's busiest thoroughfares. This creates problems that could not have been foreseen in the 1900s. Increased emissions and pollution, vibrations from the subway and traffic, climate change, increased humidity, stress on historic materials. The old ventilation and water supply systems require constant repairs. The chandeliers and moldings need restoration. The facade must be renovated every few years to protect the historic masonry. The plaza is not only a symbol, but also a fragile organism that requires costly treatment. Historians, architects, and economists agree on one thing. The future of the plaza depends on whether it can find a new public role without losing its historical essence. Several scenarios are currently being discussed. 1. The plaza as a cultural center, creation of permanent exhibitions, archives, and public programs. Transforming part of the premises into a space commemorating the Gilded Age. 2. The plaza as a model of sustainable luxury. The introduction of environmentally friendly technologies. Energy efficient systems. Improved thermal insulation. Modernized engineering networks. This would be a step towards rethinking historic buildings in the era of climate crisis. 3. Plaza as an object of global capital. The most likely scenario. Continuing to transform the hotel into an asset for large investors and states. 4. The plaza as a divided space. Part of it for the elite, part for global brands, part for the public. This hybrid format reflects modern New York, a city where glossy shop windows stand next to historic museums, and old legends exist in new formats. Looking at the big picture, like a historical chart, Plaza shows the growth of global capital, the redistribution of power, the transition from national to transnational elites, the changing concept of luxury, the growth of inequality, the struggle between cultural heritage and the market, new forms of labor, and the desire to preserve beauty in a world where it is becoming a commodity. Plaza is not just a hotel, it is a barometer of the future. It shows where America is headed, not with promises, but with facts. And that path is not always straight, not always clear, but it is always reflected in the sun-dazzled facade of this historic giant. In the evening, when Manhattan dissolves into golden smoke, the plaza becomes what it has always been, a silent witness. The light from the street lamps glides across its facade as if reading the lines of an old manuscript, lines written by architects, bankers, servants, guests, scandals, and eras. This building has outlived its creators, survived ups and downs, changes in taste and political winds. It has stood where dozens of other symbols of the Gilded Age have collapsed. But in this resilience, there is a question that sounds quieter than the noise of people. Why did the plaza survive? Because it is beautiful? Because it is famous? Or because society decided to leave it a place when others were not given one? Historians know that architecture rarely survives by chance. What survives is what is convenient for the authorities: economic, cultural, financial. And the plaza, as it turned out, fit perfectly into the new coordinate system, where buildings are not just walls, but assets, brands, symbols, mechanisms of influence. But behind this pragmatism lies another layer, the human one. Once upon a time, debutantes danced here. Carriages and later limousines stopped near the central entrance. Deals that changed the fate of corporations were made in the Oak Room. Hundreds of people worked in the corridors, their names preserved neither in the chronicles nor on marble plaques. Their labor was the invisible foundation that kept the plaza in its eternal luxury. Today, the hotel stands at the crossroads of two eras. It still evokes the New York of Eloise and Gatsby, of waltzes and diplomatic breakfasts, but it now exists in a world where the focus is on return on investment, interest rates, portfolios, and debt schemes. It has become a symbol of one of the major transformations of the 21st century, the commodification of history. And yet, at dusk on Fifth Avenue, it seems that there is something in this building that cannot be sold. Perhaps it is the sound of footsteps in the old corridor. Perhaps it is the glint of the chandelier in the empty palm court. Perhaps it is the feeling that here, among the stone and glass, America tried to create an ideal image of itself and came up against its own contradictions. The plaza reminds us of a simple truth. Every house is a choice: what to keep, what to forget, what to value. And isn't there much more power in this choice than in any political speech? Today, its windows look out on Central Park, just as they did in 1907. But the world around it has changed beyond recognition. And the question hangs over the facade like the soft light of a lantern. Can the plaza preserve its soul in a world that increasingly sees beauty only in capital? And what will we, spectators, heirs, citizens, choose when the time comes to decide what should remain? There is no answer. There is only an image, a lonely window on the top floor where the light has gone out, a shadow of the past century and a quiet hope that history, even in the age of markets, can still be heard.